Hello everybody, good morning all of you. My name is Kumar Anuj and I welcome you to Chandra classes. As you all know that we are discussing about environment and in our earlier discussion yesterday, we discussed the first part of timeline of global environmental action. And in first part we discussed about the origin of the global environmental actions, meaning the coordinated global environmental actions. So we saw, just to have a quick revision, just to have a quick revision before we just proceed to the next development with respect to the environmental actions. We saw that the birth of coordinated global environmental actions that took place in form of Conference. Stockholm Conference that took place in 1972. 1972. So this conference, Stockholm Conference, this marks the birth of coordinated global environmental actions, as we have thoroughly discussed in the first part of our discussion. And then after we have discussed that what were the reasons, I mean, if the coordinated global environmental actions started, we see in the form of Stockholm Conference to initiate with. But why? What were the reasons why the global community came together to just bring out some framework, to bring out different actions, different conferences, meeting, treaties with respect to the environment, why they came together, why the entire global community came together. So the regions we have explored that the regions were like environmental crisis, environmental crisis, environmental crisis, environmental crisis in mid 20th century, mid 20th century. So environmental crisis, because of the environmental crisis that had started taking place in mid 20th century, that awakened the global community to come together and to bring out some coordinated global efforts to tackle the environmental crisis. So this was the first major important reason, and this environmental crisis was basically this environmental crisis we see in the middle of the 20th century. This was basically like an implication of the industrial revolutions that we have had. For example, Industrial Revolution 1, Industrial Revolution 2. So industrial revolutions, they caused tremendous environmental damage, various types of depletion of resources, wildlife. So tremendous damage was caused those blind industrial revolutions that took place, especially in the Western world. If we talk about Industrial Revolution 1 and Industrial Revolution 2. Industrial Revolution 1 that took place around in the time frame of 18th and 19th century, as we all know, and especially it was concentrated to the Britain. But Industrial Revolution 2.0 that expanded to other parts of the Western world as well, in the duration of 19th and 20th century, as we have discussed. Just we are having a quick revision of the first part of our discussion about the timeline of global environmental actions, so that whenever we are just transiting towards the second part of our discussion, we are having the entire picture clear. So the first major reason was environmental crisis in mid 20th century that triggered the global community to take some environmental actions, bring out some conferences, meetings, treaties to tackle the environmental crisis. And this environmental crisis, which had started taking place in mid 20th century, was out of the implication of the industrial revolutions 1 and 2. So this was one of the most important factors that brought the global community together. The next important reason was the realization of the world community, or realization among the people, that the environmental crisis is not stuck within the borders, meaning environmental crisis is of global nature. this was realized. This was realized by the world community, by the social groups, by NGOs. So this realization that the environmental crisis is of global nature. Global nature. Global nature. It is not just limited to a particular region or boundary, because earlier we were understanding largely that environmental kind of factors or environmental kind of things, they are very concentrated to the particular kind of region or particular state or within the boundaries of a country. So we were just focusing over the localized nature of environmental crisis. But around the mid 20th century, when the environmental crisis started becoming visible globally in form of like global warming, in form of acid rain, in various other forms like ozone kind of depletion. So we just started realizing that environmental crisis is of the global nature. So we realized it. And this realization was made by the global community, by the people, by NGOs, pressure groups, and they started building pressure over the world community to bring some coordinated actions. And the next important thing was that awareness of the public, because of the realization, awareness, awareness among the public pressure groups, like NGOs, they started building pressure over the global community to bring out some framework architecture to tackle the environmental crisis before it becomes severe and detrimental to the existence of the humanity. So this was the next reason. Then after we see some of the background reports, those further instigated the global organizations like United Nations to bring out some coordinated framework. Those reports like we have discussed the limits to growth report, the limits to growth, the limits to growth. It was brought in early 1972, before the Stockholm Conference. So the limits to growth report, only one Earth, only one Earth. This was the background study report, unofficial background study report of the United Nations to just find out the possibilities, the requirements to bring coordinated action in form of Stockholm Conference that we later see. So these were the basic reasons that triggered the global community, diverted the attention of the global community towards the coordinated environmental actions. Then after, now the world community, environment, world community and the global organizations like United Nations, they became aware. And then we see that the global community, after coming together, started building the foundational framework through various conventions, meetings, and treaties. So they started building a foundational architecture over which the entire ecosystem of conferences, meetings, treaties, protocols could stand upon with respect to the tackling environmental damage. So this was the foundational framework. Under foundational framework, we saw the first major action of the global community that became visible, that was there in form of Stockholm Conference. So this was the first action of the global community. That we saw, we have discussed in the form of Stockholm Conference, as written here. This Stockholm Conference that happened in 1972 at Sweden, at Stockholm. So this Stockholm Conference marked the first coordinated global environmental action. After these regions were there, the global community was obliged to come together and to bring out some kind of global framework for the further or future environmental actions to be there in the sectoral environmental areas. like climate change, like ozone depletion. So tackling the sectoral kind of aspects of the environmental degradation or environmental challenges. So those sectoral kind of initiatives would come later on once they just build up the foundational framework for the environmental kind of, for tackling environmental crisis. So the first, then after we saw second one, that was a kind of report, but that report proved to be very effective in terms of bringing a new concept of tackling environmental crisis, that we have discussed about Brundtland report. Brundtland report. Brundtland report. This report was brought in 1987. 1987 by WCED. WCED, World Commission on Environment and Development. So this report, Brundtland report, as we have discussed in our first part of discussion, that this report brought out the foundational idea of sustainable development. It said that we cannot bifurcate the development and the sustainability, development and the environment. It said that environment and development both are integrated. We cannot say that environment is a separate thing and development is a separate thing, as we were just thinking during industrial revolutions, that development is different from the environment. But this report, Brundtland report, just changed the whole idea of tackling environmental crisis, because it puts down the integrated approach of development and environment. It said that while developing, we'll have to take care of the sustainability, the environment, and the future generations as well. Because we cannot have the blind development. We are depleting all the resources and not thinking about the future generations. Let's say, for example, for the purpose of development, we are depleting entire kind of water resources, drinking water resources. Then after, we are not thinking what our future generations, let's say 22nd century generations, what they'll do, because they'll die without the kind of presence of drinking water. So we must think, while harnessing resources, depleting resources, we must be very careful about the future generations as well, because they also have their due share in the nature. So while developing, we should take care that we are not depleting the resources up to the extent that they are making the lives of our future generations, they are putting the lives of our future generations in danger. So that's why this entire idea was put by the Brundtland report, which came in 1987 and was brought by WCED. Then after, the next foundational framework, as we have discussed in the first part, that came as a very renowned summit known as Rio Earth Summit. Rio Earth Summit. Rio Earth Summit. Rio Earth Summit. It took place in 1992. It took place in 1992. It is also known as UNCED because it was UN-led summit, United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. The idea that was brought by Brundtland report, putting the integrated approach of environment and development, or development and environment, that we see in the Rio Earth Summit, that we see that getting momentum in Rio Earth Summit, because Rio Earth Summit was itself officially known as United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, because earlier we were not just putting an integrated approach of development and environment. This sustainability concept, which was brought by the Brundtland report, became visible in Rio Earth Summit, and then after, we'll see our approaches to tackling the environmental crisis, they became completely integrated with the development. Just while developing, it means that whenever we are having any development project, we should always care about the sustainability of the project, about the environmental damage caused due to the project, and just supplementing, if there is any environmental damage, we should supplement that damage due to through some other kind of environmental kind of supplements. For example, if we are cutting trees for the purpose of building a road network, then if we are compelled to cut out the trees, then we should also plant the trees somewhere else, or just around the road, just to supplement the idea of just development and environment, just integrated approach. So whenever we are causing any kind of environmental damage out of any compulsion, we should try to supplement by just having some environmental projects or some green projects, etc., so that we are supplementing that damage with further creating natural environment. So this was the approach which was put broadly by Rio Summit in 19, which was just became visible in Rio Summit in 1992, but the foundational idea was brought by Brundtland report. So this could be the part of a question: who brought the idea of sustainable development? So the right option would be Brundtland report that came in 1987. This has been asked in our committee exams various times. So this was the entire picture that we had discussed, in the first part of our discussion. In the second part of our discussion, now we'll be discussing that once the foundational framework was put down and global community became aware about the environment, then we see the sectoral approaches. For example, the world community came together to address the sectoral aspects of environmental damage. So the first sectoral aspect we'll see that is in the form of climate change. In the form of climate change. First sectoral aspect in the form of climate change. Climate change. Climate change. Climate change. So under the climate change, when we talk about the climate change, the first major initiative taken at the global stage or global level, that was IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, setting up of IPCC. IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This IPCC panel was set up in 1988. In 1988. This Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was set up in 1988, created in 1988 by WMO, World Meteorological Organization, and UNEP together, United Nations Environment Program, as we have discussed about UNEP in our first part of our discussion of this global framework. So the first major push to address the issue of climate change at the global level was put by the creation of IPCC in 1988 by the combined efforts of WMO and UNEP. WMO and UNEP. And this IPCC was created for the assessment, for the assessment of climate change. Climate change. How the assessment would have to be done? The assessment is done by the publishing of occasional reports by the IPCC. Through the reports, we know that there are various reports of IPCC. IPCC keeps on publishing various reports of assessment of climate change time to time, maybe 5 to 6 years, in every 5 to 6 years. This gives the entire assessment of the climate change. That, I mean, where we are reaching to tackling the problem of climate change, what types of new efforts are needed by the global community, what types of changes are needed. So entire assessment remains in the reports of the IPCC that was created in 1988 by WMO and UNEP, by the combined efforts of WMO and UNEP. After IPCC, the next important initiative The next important initiative with respect to the climate change at global level came as UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This was a UN-led convention. This was also a framework convention with respect to the climate change. With respect to the climate change, UN-led convention. So when we say about UNFCCC, so this was, as we have discussed, this convention was brought out as a legally binding framework, legally binding convention. And we have seen in the first part of our discussion that UNFCCC was launched as a legally binding convention during the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. It was launched during Rio Earth Summit in 1992 as a legally binding convention. Just one thing to notice here, my friends, that whenever we talk about legally binding, anything being legally binding at the global level, because if anything is legally binding within the boundaries of a country, meaning there are enforcement mechanisms. For example, if anything is legally binding in India, then you'll have to oblige that. Otherwise, you can be in trouble. You can be in trouble because the enforcement mechanisms are there in forms of police, courts, etc. But when any convention, any treaty is called to be legally binding at the global stage, it doesn't mean that there is any global police or kind of global court to just bring any trials. So this is not like that. There is no any kind of legal kind of mechanism to address the legal kind of obligations of different countries. So when we talk about anything is legally binding at the global stage, or any convention on treaty, it means that if any of the state and countries is planting the particular kind of convention or agreement or treaty which is legally binding, then the global community will use the financial mechanisms like funding as tools to punish that state or the country. For example, funding to that particular state will be cut down. So this is one of the tools to ensure the global legal obligation of different states. Funding, then after we see uh, peer pressure, peer pressure, peer pressure meaning the pressure of other countries. For example, if any country is avoiding any legally binding kind of agreement or treaty which happened at the world stage, so other countries will build pressure upon that country to follow that. So that is peer pressure. And the next important and most effective is trade restrictions. Trade restrictions. Trade restrictions, meaning imposing tariffs on the country. And we are well aware of the tariffs nowadays because Trump is imposing new tariffs on almost each country every day. So that's why we are very well aware of the tariff regime of the US government nowadays. So this trade kind of restriction is the biggest deterrent for different countries to flaunt any kind of legally binding responsibility or legally binding agreement that had happened at the global stage, and the country is the part of that agreement. So UNFCCC brought a legally binding framework, and UNFCCC was created during Rio Summit in 1992. These are the two important factors. Then after next we see that UNFCCC has a mechanism known as COP. COP, Conference of Parties. Conference of Parties. So while talking about Conference of Parties, COP, Conference of Parties. Conference of Parties to UNFCCC. To UNFCCC. UNFCCC. Conference of Parties. Conference of Parties to UNFCCC. So this Conference of Parties, what does it mean? What does it mean? It means Conference of Parties to United Nations Framework Convention on the Climate Change. This is made out of the members. Those are the members of this convention, UNFCCC. So this Conference of Parties includes 197 parties, not exactly countries, because the UN definition of countries, that is a little different, and we have 193 countries recognized by the United Nations at the global level. So here, when we talk about 197 parties, it includes some of the global organizations as well, along with the countries. So that's why the number increases. 197 parties to UNFCCC. So this is made out of 197 parties that are the parties to the UNFCCC. And this COP, because we keep on hearing that COP26, COP15, COP16, they are taking place. COPs are different for different, maybe different organizations, because COPs are for CBD as well, UNCBD, Convention on Biological Diversity. तो COP जब हम यहाँ पर UNFCCC में बात कर रहे होते हैं, COPs could be with different conventions, as we have COP to the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity. Similarly, we have COP to UNFCCC, meaning Conference of Parties to UNFCCC. So there are 197 parties in the COP here, and this is the supreme decision making body. Supreme decision making body ऑफ अंडर द UNFCCC. ये सुप्रीम डिसीजन मेकिंग बॉडी है CCC के, UNFCCC के अंदर. यानी UNFCCC अगर कोई भी डिसीजन लेती है तो दैट डिसीजन वुड हैव टू बी रिकॉग्नाइज्ड बाय द COP, कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑफ पार्टीज. COP यानी UNFCCC के जो ऑब्लिगेशंस हैं, those obligations are constantly checked by the COP, and new kind of parameters, new types of commitments and instruments, they are constantly being created by the COPs. कोई न्यू कमिटमेंट उनको क्रिएट करना है अंडर UNFCCC, और न्यू ऑब्लिगेशन लाना है डिफरेंट कंट्रीज के लिए. सो दिस इज द वर्क डन अंडर COP कॉन्फ्रेंसेस that we take place, that we see that they take place each year. So COP conferences, COP meets annually since 1995. It meets annually since 1995, and the first COP took place in Berlin, in Germany. Berlin. The first COP conference that had taken place, that was there in the Berlin in Germany, and that took place in 1995. जो पहली COP कॉन्फ्रेंस थी वो हमारी 1995 से शुरू हुई. COP to the UNFCCC. Don't confuse the COPs with other conferences. Maybe COP to CBD as well, but that is different. COP to UNFCCC is different. So the COP to UNFCCC that meets annually since 1995, and the first meeting taken place in Berlin in Germany. Then after we see some of the other very important COP conferences like COP3. COP3. It took place in 1997. It took place in 1997 at Kyoto, in Japan. This is the most important COP conference, COP3. COP conference to the UNFCCC that took place ever. This COP3 conference that took place in 1997 at Kyoto in Japan, it adopted वेरी रिनाउंड, बहुत ही पॉपुलर जो है इन्वायरमेंट के क्षेत्र में, वेरी रिनाउंड प्रोटोकॉल नोन एज क्योटो प्रोटोकॉल. तो क्योटो प्रोटोकॉल as we very popularly study and know, this is very favorite topic for the for different competitive exams as well, if the general studies is concerned, because over Kyoto protocol I think the questions are constantly being framed in different competitive exams, because this protocol is extremely important. So now you can understand that how the Kyoto protocol came into origin. This came through COP3, Conference of Parties to the UNFCCC 3, that took place in 1997 at Kyoto in Japan. Since COP3 was taking place at Kyoto in Japan, so that's why the protocol adopted by COP is known as Kyoto Protocol. It's very simple to know, my friends. That's right. So Kyoto Protocol, now we'll have to just look into details of the Kyoto Protocol. But then after we see, first of all, we try to just look other important COPs. Then we'll just look about, we'll deep dive in the Kyoto Protocol, try to know the kind of implications of this protocol in environmental sector. Then after we have COP, which is the next important 21, COP 21, that took place in 2015 in France, and the Paris Agreement was brought. Paris Agreement was brought under this COP that takes place in 2015. This has also been asked in various competitive exams, that Paris Agreement is related to which COP? It is related to COP 21 that takes place in 2015 in France. And we also an important aspect related to the COP21 is that while attending this COP conference, our Prime Minister Modi, along with the then President of France, launched a very crucial initiative in the solar sector that is known as International Solar Alliance, ISA. So ISA was launched during the meeting of COP21 in Paris, and it was launched by our Prime Minister, Indian Prime Minister Modi, together with the then President of France. So this was another coincidental kind of incidental or related fact associated with the COP21. This has also been asked in various competitive exams, so that's why I thought that I should remind you. So this was the next important COP. Then after we see that the latest COP that took place in Baku at Azerbaijan, in Azerbaijan in 2024. COPs mostly take in November month, so that's why we see COP 29. Their last takes place in November 2024 in Baku in Azerbaijan. The next COP, COP 30, that is going to take place in Brazil in November 2025. So these are the COPs, important COPs that took place. Now we'll discuss about Kyoto Protocol adopted under COP3. So when we talk about Kyoto Protocol, when we talk about Kyoto Protocol, Kyoto Protocol, Kyoto Protocol, as we have discussed that how it was brought, when it was brought, so we are not again going to discuss the same things. So this protocol was established as a legally binding emission reduction this protocol, Kyoto Protocol, it established, this protocol established legally binding, it is important, legally binding. This feature of Kyoto Protocol has been asked in our COMPTIE exams. So this protocol, Kyoto Protocol, brought legally binding emission reduction targets, emission reduction targets, emission reduction targets, legally binding emission reduction targets for developed countries. Developed countries. Legally binding emission reduction targets for developed countries. Why only developed countries? Because developed countries are carrying the historical responsibility for the environmental degradation. Because they, under the industrial revolutions 1, 2.0, they caused tremendous damage to the global environment. So that's why since they carry more responsibility for the environmental damage, so they'll have to play the lead role as well. So that's why the legally binding emission reduction targets were set for the developed countries under the Kyoto Protocol. Targets were there for other countries as well, but they were not legally binding. So this was the first important feature of the Kyoto Protocol. It introduced, the next important feature is that it introduced the concept of carbon credits. Carbon credits. Carbon credits. What is carbon credits and why it was introduced? The carbon credits, when we talk about carbon credits, when we talk about carbon credits, so basically this concept was introduced for the developed countries to meet their emission reduction targets, emission of greenhouse gases. So emission reduction targets, so that the developed countries could meet their emission reduction targets. That's why this concept of carbon credits was brought. What is this concept? Under this concept, there were established three elements. The one is emission trading. The first was emission trading. Emission trading meaning, सपोज एक डेवलप्ड कंट्री है ए और उसने उसको जो एमिशन रिडक्शन करना था वो उतना नहीं कर पाया, यानी पर्टिकुलर ईयर में उसने जो टारगेट सेट किए थे उससे ज़्यादा एमिशन उसने कर दिया। तो जो पार्ट उसने ज़्यादा एमिशन का कर दिया है वो पार्ट उतने के क्रेडिट वो दूसरे कंट्री से जिसने अपना एमिशन रिड्यूस कर दिया है उससे वो क्रेडिट ले लेगा और उसको उसके बदले में रुपए दे देगा, खरीद लेगा। तो नाउ थ्रू द प्रोसेस ऑफ कार्बन क्रेडिट्स, डेवलप्ड कंट्रीज दे कैन बैलेंस आउट देयर एमिशन टारगेट्स। अगर वो टारगेट से ज़्यादा भी एमिट कर देते हैं तो क्या करते हैं, जो दूसरे कंट्रीज हैं जिन्होंने अपने टारगेट से कम एमिट किया है, तो जो उनका अभी द रेस्ट ऑफ द उनका एक क्वेश्चन था, वो जो कार्बन क्रेडिट के फॉर्म में जो डेवलप्ड कंट्री है जिसने ज़्यादा एमिट कर दिया है वो उससे खरीद लेगा वो शेयर, और जब वो उससे खरीद लेगा तो डेवलप्ड कंट्री जो कंट्री ए है जिसने ज़्यादा एमिशन कर दिया है उसका भी अपना टारगेट पूरा हो जाएगा। तो दिस वाज काइंड ऑफ कॉन्सेप्ट, मीनिंग आप एमिशन जो है अगर बढ़ा के कर रहे हो एज पर द लीगली बाइंडिंग लिमिट्स, then you can purchase the carbon credits from other countries, those who are reducing their emissions as compared to their set limits. So this was kind of carbon credit mechanism. Emission trading means they can trade emissions. The next point was CDM, Clean Development Mechanism. Clean Development Mechanism. Developed countries can invest in other countries, in other developing countries, in the projects of क्लीन डेवलपमेंट, मीनिंग इन द प्रोजेक्ट्स ऑफ इन्वायरमेंटल डेवलपमेंट। जैसे कोई डेवलप्ड कंट्री है, वो अपने एमिशन रिडक्शन टारगेट को अपने अपने खुद के कंट्री में वो मीट नहीं कर पा रहा है, दैट डेवलप्ड कंट्री कैन इन्वेस्ट इन अदर डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज, इन द प्रोजेक्ट्स रिलेटेड टू द इन्वायरमेंट एंड अर्न क्रेडिट्स। तो वो दूसरे डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज में इन्वेस्ट कर देगा, वहाँ वो बहुत सारे इन्वायरमेंटल प्रोजेक्ट्स में इन्वेस्ट कर देगा और उससे वो क्रेडिट अर्न कर लेगा और अपने एमिशन रिडक्शन टारगेट को मीट आउट कर लेगा। सो दिस वाज द CDM. It is important. Clean development mechanism, it can be asked in the exam. That clean development mechanism is related to which protocol? So it is related to the Kyoto Protocol. Then after we have JI, joint initiatives. JI, joint implementation. So joint implementation, it means that a developed country just जिसने अपने एमिशन जो उसके टारगेट्स थे वो उससे ज्यादा उसने एमिट कर दिया है, ऐसा डेवलप्ड कंट्री वो दूसरे डेवलप्ड कंट्री में वो मिल के साथ में ऐसे प्रोजेक्ट्स वो बना सकते हैं इन्वायरमेंट से रिलेटेड जो ज्वाइंट प्रोजेक्ट्स हों दोनों कंट्रीज के। हियर both are the developed countries are involved in joint implementation. In CDM, the developed country was investing in developing one, but here in joint implementation, both of the developed countries, they are coming together to just set out the environmental projects to earn credits together. So this was the concept introduced by Kyoto Protocol. The next important thing about Kyoto Protocol, that though it came in 1997, but it entered into force only in 2005. This has also been asked in exams. So this was about the climate change architecture, entire architecture of the climate change. Entire architecture of the climate change. First of all IPCC, then after we see UNFCCC, then we see under UNFCCC various important COP conferences, and under the COP3 that took place in 1997, we see that a protocol was adopted known as Kyoto Protocol. This protocol became a very important aspect related to tackling the problem of global warming. So it introduced legally binding emission reduction targets. It introduced the concept of carbon credits for those countries who are unable to meet their obligation under the Kyoto Protocol with respect to the emission reduction. So those countries can just fulfill their promises or obligations through the mechanism of carbon credit. So this was introduced for them. Then after we see the next important thing, that Kyoto Protocol came in force in 2005. After climate change, the next sectoral aspect while addressing the environmental challenges we see in the form of ecosystem and biodiversity. In form of ecosystem and biodiversity. In form of ecosystem and biodiversity. Ecosystem and biodiversity. Ecosystem and biodiversity. Under ecosystem and biodiversity, under this sectoral aspect of environment, we see that various efforts have been taken by the global community together in this aspect to address the issues related to the ecosystem and biodiversity. For example, Ramsar Convention that took place in 1971. But we just didn't study the Ramsar Convention under the foundational framework because Ramsar Convention tried to address one of the sectors of the environment that was sectoral. Ramsar Convention was not setting any kind of environmental framework overall. So that's why we still consider Stockholm Conference that took place in 1972 as first major coordinated global environmental action, because that was comprehensive, bringing all the stakeholders, all the parties together to just find out some architectural kind of setup to just fight the problem of environmental crisis or environmental degradation. So Stockholm Conference was a kind of a foundational conference that tried to just find out a way to go for addressing the problem of the environmental damage. But here we see the Ramsar Convention that took place in 1971 that tried to address only one of the segments of the environment, that was wetlands. And then after, under ecosystem and biodiversity, we see various other initiatives like sites initiative, initiative. Then after we see CMS, CBD, various initiatives brought by the global community to address the issues of environment related to the ecosystem and biodiversity. So this sectoral initiative, this sectoral kind of framework of environment, that is ecosystem and biodiversity, will see the coordinated global efforts in form of Ramsar Convention site, CMS, CBD, UNCCD, all those efforts of the global community in detail in our next lecture tomorrow, because these are important initiatives taken by the global community. We'll have to discuss them in detail so that we are not missing any relevant aspect which could be important for us for the exam perspective. Because our idea while discussing any of the segments of the general studies is always keeping in mind that we are only discussing those things that could be important for our exams in the paper of in the questionnaire of general studies. So that's why when ever I discuss anything, any component, any subject, any topic of general studies, always keep in mind that we are going to get into the exam, committee exam, and what are our requirements. हमारी ज़रूरतें क्या हैं exam के हिसाब से. So that's why I discuss only those aspects related to the topics that could be important for our exams, from where the questions are being asked each year. So that's why my effort with respect to the discussion is always to bring out something beneficial for us as competitive kind of aspirants, because we are preparing for the competitive exams. So our idea is not to just do PhD in any particular topic. हमें कोई किसी टॉपिक में रिसर्च नहीं करने लग जाना है, because our idea is to find out the relevant material for our exam, because we have a lot to study, a lot to just read, a lot to retain in our mind. So that's why we would only try to retain and discuss that could be important for our competitive exams. So that's what I always keep in mind while discussing anything in the class. So you people stay free. Whatever I discuss, just you'll have to concentrate over there. आप वहां पर सिर्फ concentrate करो and try to retain what I discuss. अगर जो भी हम discuss कर रहे हैं उसको revise करो, retain करो, because revision is extremely important. If you do not revise, you forget very easily. Next day you can forget. So revision and retainment, they are important, as I discuss in the class. So that's it all for today's lecture, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm excited to meet you in our next lecture with the next part of our discussion with respect to the coordinated global environmental actions. We'll be discussing about ecosystem and biodiversity and other sectoral frameworks as well in our next part of discussion of the environment. So thank you very much for joining in. Have a good day.